Chapter 5. Energy. As the sun set behind the shadow heights, the orclings and Zoggar, the young hunter, gathered around the fire with Harguth and Zul'jin. The fire crackled and sparks danced into the night sky. The two chief orcs were ready to share their wisdom and teachings with the young orcs, who were eager to learn from their experiences and knowledge. The orclings sat cross-legged around the fire, eyes wide with excitement and anticipation. Zoggar, the young hunter, sat beside them, his bow and quiver of arrows at his side. The chief orcs, Harguth and Zul'jin, sat opposite them, their faces etched with the lines of experience and wisdom. They knew that the young orcs were the future of the tribe, and it was their responsibility to guide and protect them. As they sat there, the orange and red embers of the fire casting a warm light on their faces, the two chief orcs began to share their wisdom, teaching the young orclings the ways of the tribe, the art of hunting and the strategies of war. Harguth spoke, "Our ancestors have taught us that we must never underestimate the power of energy. We must be prepared to outlast our enemies, and use our resources wisely. We must also remember that the greatest victory is achieved by winning without engaging in battle. We must plan ahead and utilize all of our resources to the fullest. The greatest victories are those won through strategy, not through force." Zul'jin grunted and paused for a moment, looking at the orclings around him before continuing. "We must also remember that the gods can intervene in our battles and will do so if we summon them with enough faith. Controlling a large army is no different than controlling a small one," Zul'jin declared with a nod. "It is simply a matter of dividing our forces and deploying them in the most advantageous positions." Harguth nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, for this reason we must be careful to send our troops to places where they can make the greatest impact on the battle. The fate will decide the outcome of any battle, but we must do all we can to increase our chances of victory." The orclings around the fire nodded eagerly in agreement, their eyes wide with excitement. Zoggar, the young hunter, piped up, "What if we can't control the terrain? How can we still make sure we have an advantage?" Harguth smiled at the young orc's enthusiasm. "We can use our intelligence and knowledge of the enemy to our advantage. We must be aware of their strengths and weaknesses and use them against them. And we can also use our wits and trickery to gain an edge. It is true that a larger army requires more complex strategies and communication," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. "But we must remember that the same principles of battle apply to any size force. We must use signs and signals to our advantage and never underestimate the power of careful planning." He glanced at Zoggar and added, "Even with a small group, proper communication can make all the difference in the outcome of a battle." Zul'jin nodded thoughtfully and then said, "It is also important to remember that the gods favor those who are brave and determined. We must remain steadfast and courageous if we are to prevail." He clapped his hands together and the orclings stirred and murmured in agreement. "Indeed," Harguth agreed and raised his hand, signaling the young orclings to be quiet. "We must use both direct and indirect tactics in order to succeed. Our elders have taught us that it is not always wise to go head-on into battle, as that can lead to our own demise." He paused for a moment before continuing, "We must also remember to use our environment and the elements to our benefit. We must be sure to use our forces wisely," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. "Our army must be like a grindstone, able to break through the strongest of defenses, yet remain gentle and precise enough not to shatter an egg." He paused and looked around at the young orclings, who were listening attentively, before continuing. "This is the science of weak points and strong, and we must remember it if we are to succeed in this war. It is known," Zul'jin said, gesturing with his hands, "that direct methods are best for joining battle, but indirect methods are what will secure our victory." He paused and glanced at the orclings, who were wide-eyed and attentive. "We must be cunning and use every resource available to us if we are to defeat our enemies. Yes, we must also remember that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. We must do all that we can to ensure our success, but in the end, only Tempest knows what will happen." Harguth sighed and stoked the fire, sending sparks into the night sky. The orclings murmured softly and snuggled closer to the fire. Harguth measured his hand slowly in the air. "The ancients have spoken truly," he said. "We must be wise and shrewd in our strategies if we are to succeed. The terrain can be either our ally or our enemy, depending on how we use it." The orclings around them stirred, eager to learn more. Zoggar spoke up, asking, "What do you mean by indirect tactics?" Harguth smiled at the young orc's curiosity. Indirect tactics, he said, are those tactics which allow us to make use of our environment to gain an advantage over our enemies. For example, we can use the terrain to hide our forces or to cause confusion amongst our enemies, or to lure them into a trap. The possibilities are endless, but they all require careful planning and execution. We must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to succeed, Zul'jin stated solemnly and tended the fire. We must heed the wisdom of our ancestors and remember that the power of a few can create a symphony of victory. Even with limited resources, if used wisely, great success can be achieved. The orclings around the fire murmured their understanding, and Zoggar asked, "What does that mean, Chief Zul'jin?" Zul'jin smiled and replied, "It means that no matter how well you plan, or how hard you fight, there will always be an element of luck involved in any battle. We must accept that and trust in fate." The orclings nodded in agreement, and Zul'jin added, "Yes, and never underestimate the power of a few. Together, we can create a symphony of victory. We must be ever vigilant in our battle plans, for just as the 5 primary colors can create a multitude of hues, so too can our strategies create many varied outcomes." Zul'jin paused for a long moment before adding, "We must also remember that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate." The orclings grumbled in agreement, and Zoggar added, "So, it's important not to get too attached to one plan of attack, but to be prepared for anything." Harguth nodded, his face grave. "Indeed. We must always be mindful of the possibilities and remain flexible in our tactics. The future is uncertain, and we must be ready for whatever comes our way. It is true that 5 tastes can be combined to create an infinite number of flavors. Our ancestors taught us that there are more than just these 5 tastes: sweetness, sourness, bitterness, saltiness, and acridity, but by combining them we can create a vast array of flavors." Harguth looked around the fire at the orclings, who were still wide-eyed with interest. "And it is the same with strategy. We must combine different tactics in order to succeed in battle, and be ever vigilant of our surroundings." Zul'jin added, "We must also remember the importance of timing. To achieve victory, one must know when to strike and when to hold back." He gestured to the orclings, who had grown sleepy. "Now go, my children, and remember this wisdom. Our ancestors taught us that there are 2 methods of attack, the direct and the indirect. We must combine them to create our own unique strategies," Zul'jin said. Harguth's eyes twinkled in the firelight. "We must be careful to outwit our enemies." At this, the young orclings around the fire stirred, their eyes wide with awe. Zoggar, the eldest of them all, spoke up. "So, we must be smart in how we fight, but also trust in the gods?" Harguth smiled. "Yes, Zoggar. That is the way of our people. We must be wise and brave, and trust in tempest. A wise strategy is to make use of both direct and indirect tactics," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. "The indirect can be used to confuse our enemies, while the direct can be used to strike quickly and decisively. It is a balance that will bring victory." Zul'jin nodded in agreement. "Indeed, we must make use of every resource available to us. We must also remember that success in battle requires patience and cunning, not just strength and courage." The orclings, who had been listening intently, began to ask questions about the strategy, which the 2 chiefs patiently answered. Zul'jin's eyes blazed. "Our ancestors taught us to use the power of our forces as if it were a raging river," he said. "When used correctly, we can use it to sweep away anything in our path." Harguth looked solemnly into the fire. "We must also remember that no matter how wise our plans may be, there are still unknown forces at work that can alter the course of events." The young orclings shifted and murmured among themselves. Zoggar asked a question. "So, what should we do then?" Zul'jin smiled. "We must be prepared for all eventualities," he answered. "We must think ahead, anticipate our enemies' moves, and be ready to respond swiftly and decisively when needed. We must never underestimate the power of surprise and strategy." Harguth nodded in agreement and added, "Above all, we must have courage and faith in ourselves and in the strength of our allies. With these 2 things, we will prevail no matter what obstacles may come our way. We must be swift and decisive in our actions if we are to succeed. As the ancient Orcish proverb says, the quality of decision is like the well-timed swoop of a falcon which enables it to strike and destroy its victim." Zul'jin said. Harguth nodded and added, we must also remember that even the strongest warriors are vulnerable to the elements. We must use all the resources at our disposal to turn the tide of battle in our favor. The orclings around the fire murmured their assent, and Zoggar asked, what other strategies should we consider? We must be prepared to face any eventuality, Harguth replied. We must be flexible and adaptive, ready to adjust our plans as needed. We must also anticipate our enemies' moves and be one step ahead of them at all times. Indeed, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. We must be sure to strike quickly and decisively if we wish to win this war. We cannot afford to hesitate or waver in our actions. The young orclings were wide-eyed with awe at the chief's words, and Zoggar asked, but how can we know what fate has in store for us? How can we prepare for an unpredictable outcome? Harguth smiled and nodded. We can never predict the future, but we can prepare for it. We must be vigilant in our plans and strategies, and use our resources wisely. We must also have faith that Tempest will guide us to victory. Energy, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands as if he was holding a bow. It is like the bending of a bow, we must be sure to use our strength and resources wisely to strike a powerful blow. He paused for a moment, then continued, decision, on the other hand, is like releasing the trigger. We must be swift and decisive in our actions, or risk missing our chance at victory. The two orc chiefs were silent for a moment, contemplating the wisdom of their ancestors. Zoggar, who had been listening intently, spoke up. But what if we are outnumbered? How can we still win? Harguth smiled and looked at the young orc. That is a wise question, Zoggar. We must use our wits and cunning to outsmart our enemies. We must be resourceful and make the most of our limited resources. And when all else fails, we must have faith in Tempest and her power to protect us. He turned to Zul'jin and nodded. Yes, indeed, Zul'jin said, gesturing as he spoke. We must be ever mindful of the chaotic nature of war and use it to our advantage. We must remember that even in chaos there is order, and that our enemy may be confused and disoriented while we remain focused and organized. He paused for a moment before adding, we must also remember that no matter how chaotic the battle becomes, we can never be defeated if we have faith in our own strength and strategy. It is known, Harguth said as he stirred the flames of the campfire, that we must use our resources wisely and be mindful of our environment if we are to be successful in battle. Our ancestors have taught us that if we can make our opponents believe that we are weaker than them, then we can gain an advantage. We must also remember that no matter how prepared we are, the outcome of any battle ultimately lies in the hands of fate. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, adding with a hint of amusement, indeed, we must create the illusion of disorder so that our enemies will be thrown off balance and unable to gauge our true strength. The two chiefs shared a knowing look before turning their attention back to the fire. Zoggar spoke up, asking for clarification on what the chiefs had just said. Harguth smiled at the young orc and explained, what I meant was that we must confuse our enemies by appearing weak and disorganized, even if we are not. This way, they will not be able to predict our next move and will be unprepared for our attack. We must be clever in our strategy if we are to succeed, Zul'jin agreed, nodding his head slowly. We cannot rely on brute force alone, we must also use our cunning and guile. Harguth nodded in agreement, adding, yes, we must be prepared for any eventuality and use both our strength and our wits to outwit our enemies. We must also take into account the whims of fate, as she can often be unpredictable. The orclings around the fire stirred, eager to hear more. Zoggar, the young hunter, spoke up. But what if our enemies have a plan of their own? What then? Harguth smiled. Then we must be ready to counter whatever they may throw at us. We must be ever vigilant and watchful, and never underestimate our opponents. With careful planning and strategy, we can prevail. Zul'jin nodded. Indeed. We must always be mindful of our surroundings and use whatever tools are available to us. Even in the darkest hour, we can find hope and strength within ourselves to carry on. Indeed, Harguth nodded as he stirred the fire with a stick. We must be cunning and crafty in our tactics if we are to outwit our adversaries. We must use their own desires against them and make them think that they have the upper hand, when in reality we are setting up traps and ambushes for them. He paused for a moment and looked at Zul'jin seriously. We must also remember that although it is important to be deceptive, we must never forget the value of strength and courage in battle. We must be like the baited bear, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. We must lure our enemy into a false sense of security and then strike them when they least expect it. He turned to Zul'jin and added, but the outcome lies in the hands of fate. The orclings began to murmur in agreement, and Zoggar asked, what does this mean, Chief Harguth? How do we use fate to our advantage? Harguth smiled and replied, it means that we must be prepared for anything. We must be ready to take advantage of any opportunity that presents itself, no matter how small. We must have faith in ourselves and in Tempest, and trust that the gods will guide us to victory. Harguth nodded in agreement and said, our ancestors have taught us that the power of many is far greater than that of one. We must use our combined strength and knowledge to best our foes. He gestured to Zoggar, who was observing from nearby. It is important that we foster young warriors like Zoggar, so that he can learn from our experiences and become a great warrior himself. Zul'jin grunted in agreement, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Indeed, it is essential that we pass on our wisdom to the next generation, so they may carry on our legacy, he said. We must also remember that our enemies will not be easily defeated, so it is vital that we prepare ourselves for any eventuality. Our ancestors taught us that we must use our combined energy if we are to succeed, Zul'jin said, gesturing to the fire with his hand. We must remember that it is like a rolling log or stone, when on level ground it remains motionless, but when on a slope it will move. If we use this principle in battle, we can achieve victory. Harguth nodded in agreement and added, we must also remember that, like a log or stone, if we are four-cornered we can come to a standstill, but if round-shaped, we will go rolling down. The young orclings watched and listened as the two chief orcs discussed the ancient orcish wisdoms of war, learning from their experiences and knowledge. The fire crackled and the stars shone above, as the orcs shared their wisdom and prepared for the battles ahead.